So our guest today is Dr. David McIvor. He's joining us from Colorado State University, political scientist, political theorist with a pretty wide range, but has published a book about the politics of mourning and race in America, and is also a Kleinian psychoanalyst. I would say he shared two pieces with us. One that we've talked about previously, which was the fugitive democracy concept. What does it mean for us to be living in a time when democracy is imperiled? And the other piece that he shared with us is, if I'm not mistaken, it's a working paper, right? About pretty very polished, very almost paper about breath work, and looking at the dimensions, the sort of somatic dimensions of breath with regards to like activism. And so, yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Shane. And yeah, the second piece I sent around, the breath work, it's somewhere between a working paper and a polished piece. It actually is forthcoming in an edited volume. And they limited us to 6,000 words, and it probably requires a 60,000 word manuscript to really kind of do what I want to do in that piece. But I was happy to share that with you all. And I should say I'm not a practicing psychoanalyst, nor have I been analyzed, but psychoanalysis is sort of a big part of my research, and I won't talk too much about that today. And I have like a hard stop at like 5 to the hour, and so I'd like to kind of get a sense for who's in the room, but I don't know if we have time to kind of go around and do the circle of the room. So if I could ask folks just to sort of put in the chat, like, you know, who you are and kind of, you know, what you study a little bit, and then as we maybe get to Q&A, I could kind of just go over that and see who's in the room. But it's great to be with you all today. Great to see Shane again. Shane was one of our master students here at Colorado State a few years ago during the pandemic days, and it's good to see Shane in this exciting new intellectual context. So I don't know if you gave me the share screen privileges, but I have some slides that I thought I would share. Okay, allow Zoom to share your screen, open system preferences, of course, because I just got this new computer. Turn this on. I have to use my password. That's fine. Okay, let's see if this will work. Share screen. Here we go. So hopefully you all had a chance to, is that working for everybody? Can everybody see this? Anybody see this? So hopefully you all had a chance to look at the piece that I sent around, the fugitive democracy piece. And I didn't want to assume a lot of familiarity with this concept or the field in which I'm situated in political theory. So I thought I'd take a step back and sort of talk about how I'm situated, specifically with regards to the work of Sheldon Wolin, where this concept of fugitive democracy comes from. And Wolin talks about political theory as a vocation, right, as a practice, as a sort of set of commitments, not just an academic or intellectual pursuit, but sort of a public and political vocation, profession, right, that we're engaged in. He's articulated this most famously in 1960 in his book, Politics and Vision, expanded in 2004. And Wolin makes the argument there that political theory at its root, at its foundation, is oriented around a care and concern for what is common or public, which means that political theory should not see itself as an esoteric pursuit or as a pursuit for esoteric truths, but as concerned with what we are facing as a public or as a polity. That's the kind of starting point for political theory. And Wolin also very famously in that piece argues that political theory is sort of most necessary and most viable in times of crisis, when the sort of terms by which we organize our lives and our political lives seem to break down or decline in symbolic efficacy. And I'm not alone in saying that the moment that we seem to be in, both in this country and elsewhere, is pretty easily characterized as a moment of crisis, where we're kind of in this fluid and fluctuating period where the terms of political reality seem to be jostling around and contested. And so Wolin, plays upon the sort of double meaning of vision in talking about how to respond to crisis. And he says, on the one hand, vision is just a descriptive account of reality. Like what do we see in front of us? How can we understand the world in front of us? But vision also has this sort of imaginative and aesthetic quality to it, which means that political theory, its articulations are never fully reducible down to the sort of empirical world as we understand it or can describe it. There always is this gap between world as it is, world as we can see it, world as we would like it to be. And political theory moves back and forth between these registers of vision for Sheldon Wolin. And recently, I have a forthcoming piece with my co-authors, Ali Aslam and Joel Schlosser, and several other folks, Libby Anker, George Washington, and Roman Coles, on trying to think about this concept of visionary political theory in a moment of crisis. And we're all inspired by this idea by Gloria Anzaldúa that political theory is not, political theory is a practice, right? Political theory, we can talk about the canon, we can talk about the importance of traditional texts and historical texts, but primarily, political theory is a practice for the living, right? And it's a practice for Anzaldúa of envisioning, this sort of work of envisioning, working through our troubles, working through crisis in the world, as opposed to the search for a kind of singular vision that can organize reality or make reality sort of cohere together. Though both of those things seem impossible for Anzaldúa. So that brings me to the paper, Fugitive Democracy, or Democracy in an Age of Fugitivity. And this concept of fugitive democracy is probably one of Wolin's most famous ideas, and we pick up on this strand and work with it in this paper. And for Wolin, fugitive democracy says nothing more than that democracy is really destined to be a moment. It's a momentary sort of eruption in the political sphere. It's not, democracy is not a sort of stable form or a stable set of institutions or a realizable form. It is these kind of temporary moments of sort of insurgent coming together. So he says it's a rebellious moment through which people temporarily obtain what he calls a political mode of existence. And political mode of existence, this goes back to how Wolin defines political theory, right? Because he says, when we step into a political mode of existence, we come to take care and concern for that which is common, that which is public, which sort of rises above our own individual personal self-interest. And this happens by virtue of participation in public deliberation and decision-making. And insofar as folks are able to do that, you can sort of become political. This usually happens in a rebellious moment, and then it kind of can quickly fade. That's why democracy for Wolin is this kind of moment, as opposed to a settled form of government. Now, a lot of folks have criticized, as I mentioned in the papers, we mentioned in the paper, Wolin for this idea, because it seems to admit defeat, that democracy, we can't have substantive democracy as a form of life or as a form of government, right? That democracy is just these sort of rebellious moments, and it seems to sort of have this romance or a romantic notion of democracy as these moments of popular uprising or insurgency, and it doesn't seem to give any sort of hope for a settled politics in which we could sort of constrain the rule of elites or make elites accountable to popular majorities or these sorts of things. But our reading of fugitive democracy is that it's not an admission of defeat, it's just holding democracy to a higher standard. I was actually in an unrelated, but I think a reasonable metaphor. I was watching a lecture about the gut microbe in all of us and how important this is for our health and our longevity and health span and all these sorts of things. And they've done all these different samples of different gut microbes from different populations, say from like advanced Western industrial societies and then like hunter-gatherer societies and people with more traditional life ways. And the gut microbe of people, say, living in this country, in advanced industrialized countries, advanced industrialized diets, is just radically different than it is for extant surviving hunter-gatherer tribes and these sorts of things. And so the idea is, what constitutes a healthy gut microbe for people in our context? Well, you're generalizing from what people call a depleted sample. So like our baseline is pretty low, but we say, well, this is the standard for health. This is the standard for well-being. I think we have a similar practice with regards to democracy. We say, well, democracy is competitive elections, and democracy is political parties, and democracy is responsive institutions and balance of powers, and these sorts of, we can all have our laundry list of liberal democratic sort of norms and practices and institutions. But I think we're generalizing from a depleted sample, that actually existing democracies, the way in which we talk about them as being normative is based on a lower baseline than we should be aspiring towards as a species, as a collectivity. So myself and my co-authors, we argue that fugitive democracy is actually just trying to hold democracy to a higher standard than a lot of the literature in democratic theory, for instance. And then in the piece, as hopefully you all had a chance to read, we sort of see fugitivity as kind of positioned between a politics of renewal and a politics of flight. So politics of flight, this is this idea has been taken up by a lot of different people. Neil Roberts and his idea of freedom as marronage. Fred Moten and Stefano Harney talk about flight, and so many other folks. This idea that the modern nation state is so oppressive or leaves such little space for actual sort of sociability or freedom or collective emancipation that you just need to imagine completely alternative, completely radical alternatives to this state form, right? And so you're essentially identifying or conceptualizing freedom or emancipation as flight away from the state, right? The art of not being governed in James Scott's idea, and this idea of zomia, this sort of free realm, which is sort of out of the reach of the state. And then you have folks within, say, the deliberative democratic literature or social movement literature, which are saying, that flight leaves too many possibilities untheorized or unconceptualized, right? And so you need to imagine ways in which collective freedom or collective emancipation can be renewed in the situation in which we find ourselves, as opposed to like fleeing for alternatives or for the highlands or for the swamps or these sorts of things. And we think both of those literatures have a lot to say about the aspirations for democracy, but the benefit of the concept of fugitivity is it doesn't take sides between them, right? That it wants to position itself in the sort of ambivalent zone between renewal of democratic possibilities in the context and situations in which we find ourselves, and the possibility of flight and pursuing radical alternatives, whether it's sort of a Zapatista idea or Rojava and Syria or these other sorts of islands of emancipated life, ideally. And just a few more things on this, again, on this idea that fugitive democracy for its critics seems to offer this idea of a radical participatory democracy, which is unrealistic in our day and age. It's the whole Benjamin Constant famous idea of the liberty of the ancients as self-government and participation versus the liberty of the moderns, negative liberty, negative freedom, having your property, life, liberty, and property protected. But again, we make the argument that this is less the liberty of the ancients and it is just this ancient desire for liberty. And we've all my co-authors and I have been very inspired by the recent work by David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, which is sort of summarizing a lot of emerging archaeological evidence of non-hierarchical societies, non-state-like societies that existed for long periods of time without developing priestly castes or bureaucracies or sort of other forms of centralized power or hierarchy. And we, in a larger project that we're working on, are trying to use that as an idea for recreating a sort of deeper history of democracy, which isn't just these islands of, okay, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, maybe the populists, right? But has a longer continuity within the history of the species. It just hasn't been told because so much of it is the product of non-literate cultures. again, so this kind of repeats what I was saying earlier. Fugitivity positions itself between flight and renewal. It's simultaneously a flight from danger and a movement toward new possibilities. And it also, again, provides this sort of standard for evaluating extant or existing institutions and practices, right? So whether institutions serve democratization or threaten it is clarified by this concept of fugitive democracy, right? It takes democracy seriously. This idea that institutions can either reinforce popular power or they attenuate it, and it provides this sort of baseline and standard for making that evaluation. And then briefly, I'll just talk a little bit about the second paper that I sent around, which, is something of a, like I said, some position somewhere between a polished paper and a very working draft. But it's again trying to sort of move us into this interesting space between thinking about catastrophe and renewal, right? Catastrophe and the possibility for emergence of alternatives. And so I turned to this literature on plasticity, but primarily I'm sort of interested in this move from Woolen's concept of the common to the work of Norman O. Brown and what Norman O. Brown calls metapolitics. And Brown talks about how, and it'd be interesting to put this in conversation with Foucault, for instance. I haven't done this yet, but Brown talks about how the body is a political organization, right? Not just on the individual level, but on the collective level. And it's historical. It alters over time. It's sort of plastic medium. So how our bodies are shaped, or how you could say our gut microbe is shaped, is a political project or the artifact of political projects. This relates to a few things that I'm working on on my own and with my colleagues. One is this piece on the politics of the unconscious and thinking about the relationship between democracy and the unconscious. We have a piece that's forthcoming soon in Polity on this. But I'm also looking at this question of plasticity, and here the work of Catherine Malibu has been influential. This idea of how do you take advantage of the plasticity of the body, of the bios, in order to imagine transformation, metamorphosis within the body politic, right? So using the powers of indeterminacy, the fact that our brains are actually these fluid and mobile things that can rearrange themselves on the basis of the stimuli that we put to them. Our gut microbe, the same thing, and the gut brain, all these connections, right? How can you take advantage of indeterminacy, these little stitches of indeterminacy from within seemingly determinate systems, right? And I use breath work both as a metaphor for thinking about how we can be connected in this sort of interdependent web of relations, but breathwork also as a medium of plasticity, a medium by which we exploit the sort of indeterminacy within automatic systems. Because if you think about it, you don't actually have to think to breathe. You breathe automatically. The autonomic nervous system takes care of this. But you can actually, quote unquote, hack that and alter that. And that creates all sorts of possibilities up and down the line. So I'm using that both as a metaphor, but also as, I think, just, a solid way for thinking about how to bring about different politics. And then towards the end of that piece, if you had a chance to look at it, I discussed several different activist movements and social movements that are sort of waking up to this idea as well, that the body has to be a sort of central variable in movement politics today, and the sort of health and well-being of the body has to be a central variable in movement politics today. So whether it's folks from a regenerative activism lens, or generative somatics, or the pleasure activism of Adrienne Marie Brown, this idea of a movement, say, from like interests or parties or discourse to the body, right? And the attentiveness and care of the body as both a means of generating more successful and more potent activist movements, but also as an end in and of itself, right? So be the change that you seek in the world and these sorts of things. And that's the piece that I sent around that is forthcoming in this edited volume through Routledge. So that was just kind of a quick, I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and comments and discussion and conversation. So I'll leave it at that and see if folks have questions on any of this. And it's a great pleasure to be with you all. Now I can look in the chat and see who all of you are as well.
Great. Thank you so much again for joining us, and that was amazing. Yeah. I think that so one of the questions that was kind of lingering from our previous discussion that I think will come up, and I feel like this inclusion of like somatic practices in the body lend itself to sort of unpacking this discussion, maybe, is like the question of political agency itself. It seems like there's the tension of the sort of overdetermined, institutionalization of like democratic forms of government, for example, versus, in various ways, the little guy or something like this. And like when you mentioned James C. Scott in particular, I couldn't help but I've been thinking about politics locally, that is in Appalachia a lot. And like, in a lot of ways, historically, the friction of terrain, as Scott would say, here with, caves, massive cave systems and these old mountains and stuff, led to, novel forms of political and popular resistance, even in this area. But today, some of the problems that I'm aware of, like on the activist front, are like problems of pollution, and like the pipeline and so on and so forth, things that have the potential to disrupt bodies, and we see not just here but also, like, I think globally, how a lot of times these sort of pollutants, and you mentioned this in your paper too, but like how like there's a disparity between like the way that what Mbembe calls like death worlds, right, are these sort of dumping grounds for the rest of the developed world. And so I'd be curious if you wanted to speak to, so I guess it's kind of two questions, but one is like where is this question of agency, and then second is what are poisoned, sickly, death world bodies to do about organizing any sort of democratic polity, if they're already sort of like always already dumped on, and in such a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a profound question. I mean, I think it relates to this larger tension that I see in a lot of, call it radical theory or critical theory today, right? Which is this felt obligation and duty to describe just how fucking terrible things are, right? And just how steep the obstacles are to any sort of redress of that, or positive possibility coming out of that, right? So there's that sort of side of things. And you were just at the Western Conference, and there's kind of now this almost cliched, I would say, obligation for the first 2 minutes of anybody's presentation, which is just this laundry list of all the things that are awful and terrible. And I think that's necessary, because that's the first side of vision we need to be sensitive to and attuned to the piling damages of industrial development and late stage capitalism and racial capitalism. And again, we all know these terms, right? So there's a sort of duty and obligation to be sensitive to that. On the other hand, I think what I've been trying to do in my work for the last, 5, 7, 10 years is to theorize the possibilities of metamorphosis, right? I mean, the work of Norman O. Brown, again, has been so influential for me in the last few years of my thinking. And he has this great title of one of the last set of essays that he published called Apocalypse and/or Metamorphosis, right? Like the apocalypse is there, right? The sort of disaster and destruction, the clarification, all the different connotations and meanings of apocalypse. The question then becomes, what does metamorphosis look like? What does transformation look like? And this is where I am continually sort of dumbfounded and shocked and surprised by the regenerative capacities of species, of ecologies, of bodies. You know, I mean, Shane, you've been in this horrible motorcycle accident, and you know, here you are with, you know, you're smiling and, you know, these sorts of things. And we've been talking. I was in a terrible accident when I was a graduate student as well. And I mean, the body does have some pretty incredible plastic powers for renewal. And I also read about a year ago Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life, about mycelial networks and the way that mycelial networks are like toxin chomping machines, right? Like you can put mycelium on these sort of toxic waste dumps, and they eat it like we eat popcorn, you know, like so that's where I've been. And I'm not even, I was going to use the word solace, like I've found some solace. It's not even solace, but that's where I've located this sense of possibility. And I think we are at a time, like what, who says this shit like that? But I mean, I think when I speak to my students, I feel like when I speak to people in their 20s, I feel like they are, you know, they're looking for positive possibilities, right? They're looking for a sense of how to invest themselves and their lives and their aspirations and these sorts of things. And I just think there is a lot coming out of disaster, right? Coming out of catastrophe and learning from places that have not bounced back in the sense that it's a return to status quo ex ante, but bounced, you know, like regenerated, recreated in ways that are, you know, novel and new, but show that life and death are sort of always paired, right? And so I guess I'm singing the hymns of Dionysus and renewal a little bit, or trying to as best I can from my position. But that in some way we sort of respond to where you're going. So, and I also, to go to your point about Appalachia, I think that there is this sort of key assumption within, call it radical democratic theory or Wolinian style democratic theory, that we shouldn't understate the plastic potentials of ordinary people. You know, we shouldn't understate the inherent capacities for imagination, for creative action, for creative response to conditions, by the demos, by the people. And if we take the step of assuming incapacity, assuming a complete absence of agency, then, you know, we're not doing democratic theory anymore, right? We're doing some sort of condescending liberal theory, and I do think liberal democratic kind of creates a contradiction. Yeah, I'm less interested in that. So trust the people when they become trustworthy, you know, Lao Tzu.
Thanks. Yeah, does anybody else want to jump into the fray here?
Well, I'll ask. Thank you so much, David, for being with us. I apologize for any background noise, but you know, in a previous bio, I just happened to see that you've done some work with regarding the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Committee as well, and we've been blessed that we're engaged with one of the principals and some other work down here now. But I'm kind of intrigued, you know, the sense of mourning that I know you've done some work on in this space, and regeneration coming from mourning, and you know, these processes that allow for moving forward theoretically, or you know, truth, maybe reconciliation. I haven't read your work on this, but I'd be intrigued to know kind of how you interpreted that work and how you're looking at mourning in those kind of places.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And I mean, yeah, I think the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for those of you who aren't aware of that work, I mean, I think it's one of these really undertold stories in the last 20 years in American democracy. And I think what made that so relevant for me was precisely what I was saying earlier about we shouldn't understate we would be wise not to understate the capacities for quote unquote ordinary people to imagine new possibilities in their collective lives. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Greensboro is an example of this. So they tried for several years to go through the city council, couldn't get anything passed, couldn't get any support through the city level. And then they finally just decided to kind of do it on their own. And there were a lot of positives that came from doing that, insofar as you got more people aware of it and participating in it and taking it as a legitimate process, because it wasn't coming from the city government, which was itself distrusted, right? I mean, one thing we should not we should be sensitive to is how much radical distrust there is towards official institutions, right? So when things come out of official institutions, we say, okay, that's the legitimate process. But for a lot of people, a lot of the demos, that doesn't provide legitimacy, right? So, but the fact that this was sort of a grassroots organized and funded process gave it a lot more, I think, legitimacy and viability in the eyes of many people who were part of that. And yeah, I mean, I see Mourning. I mean, I could give you the full long spiel on that, but I see Mourning not necessarily as an overcoming of loss, but as a clarifying of what loss has meant to us, or what the things that we have lost have meant to us. And there's a way in which, on my reading of Mourning, based on the work of Melanie Klein, that involves accepting the ambivalence of ourselves. That it means accepting that we have ambivalence towards the things that we've lost. That there's both feelings of love and hate towards everything in our lives, including ourselves, and the sort of tolerance of that ambivalence is a sort of central aspect for Klein of coming to this integrated ego. And I think it's also a lesson for democracy of accepting that there's conflict, accepting that there's disagreement, accepting that there is ambivalence while still fighting for justice, right? Not presuming or assuming you can get to a place of beyond conflict or a place of absolute reconciliation. So that's the kind of edge that I put against the term reconciliation, that what truth does is it orients us to be reconciled within ourselves to the fact that we live in a complicated and conflicted world. And from that position, people are better able to collaborate with others, right? Because if you're in a position where you are denying the complexity of the world, denying the complexity of your attachments, then it's very easy to mobilize you through scapegoats and through the sort of simplification of politics and demagoguery, and it's all this group's fault or it's all this group's fault, and the kind of scapegoating politics that happens there. So for me, the Truth and Reconciliation process in Greensboro was so valuable because it clarifies those disagreements, right? It clarifies that context of conflict, and better enables and prepares and trains people to engage in that without magical thinking and wishful thinking, right? That conflict will just sort of disappear or dissipate, or that we won't have to, fight for justice, right? It will remain a continuing obligation and fight over time. So I don't know if that's helpful, or if there's pieces of that you'd want to pick up and.
It's very helpful. I'm personally very interested in trust in this local context, in these particular kinds of places. And so you mentioned it in your context there, and I'd be the idea of these kind of ephemeral organizations as a bridge towards rebuilding trust is something I'm interested in exploring. And so I wonder if you think that there has been a trust repair process of any kind associated with this, or if it remains as you say, the conflict is more clear, but there has that's a separate question in some ways from the Truth and Reconciliation work.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could make an argument for both, right? That there's still distrust, but there has been new bonds forged and new bridging social capital created and all sorts of things. I mean, in the book, I talk about it in terms of like there are ripple effects from this. I mean, this is also Hannah Arendt on the nature of political action, that you don't really know what the consequences of any action are going to be, but you know there will be consequences. And I think in Greensboro, I think it was complicated and it was uneven, but there were a lot of what we would say positive, small d, democratic things that came out of it. Primarily, I think this idea that people who don't have the backing of an official state agency or institution can do this sort of work, can do this sort of high profile work, which gets media attention, which gets scholarly attention, which gets activist attention, creates a sort of buzz, context of interest around these issues, and makes these issues more public and more salient. Like that is a sort of democratic lesson. I mean, this goes to Tocqueville, right? A sort of small d democratic lesson that is one I think we don't teach very much. I mean, I teach a class in democratic theory, and all the students come into the class thinking that democracy is elections and what representatives do and these sorts of things. And, it's a profound cultural misunderstanding that is functional for elite domination. And so I think some of the work of democratic theory is to challenge that functional, dysfunctional story about the possibilities for democracy. We'll leave it at that, I guess. But
yeah, it's one of the things. Oh, go ahead.
I think Lucy was coming in. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk and for sharing your work. In your 2019 piece, you all talk about experimentation, and I really like that idea. I think it fits well with fugitive democracy. Problem with experiments is that sometimes experiments fail.
Sure.
And so I wonder how you've been thinking about when experiments in radical democracy or alternative economic alliances or organizations or pockets of fugitive democracy fail or shut down, almost inevitably resulting in the consolidation back into the power of the state. I'm thinking about in Blacksburg, many of this audience may be familiar with a kind of like collab or maybe involved in this a little like mutual aid organization called Southpaw, which kind of had to leave its building and is no longer has this like really great prominence base in downtown Blacksburg. And so I'm wondering how maybe you and your co-authors are thinking about the kind of way that such power is kind of like immediately sucked back into the consolidated power of the state, and opportunities to resist that or rethink that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a profound question. I mean, I want to answer it in sort of two directions. I mean, one is, the sort of Dionysian in me says, well, you create a million of these things, right? They're bound to fail, like they're bound to die, right? That death is sort of a part of the life cycle of successful movements, or successful experiments. To say that these things fade or fail or die is a sort of ultimate indictment of them is I think it's a judgment from a particular perspective, which is not emphasizing that they got created in the first place and celebrating their creation in the first place, right? I mean, so I think I'm more interested in that moment and celebrating that moment and accepting and understanding that all that is flesh shall fail, and like nothing will last forever. And yes, these things are all sort of facing this uphill sort of struggle, right? In an age of, well, I mean, call it, concentrations of power, asymmetries of power, hierarchies, right? Lack of space for these sorts of things, but then also these cultural stories and scripts about the lack of agency, about powerlessness, all these other things that we were just talking about, right? So always a sort of uphill struggle in that, but I think emphasizing and celebrating the moments of emergence and accepting death as a part of life and a part of movements as is probably a better orientation. There's another piece that Joel and Ali and I have written about, where's democracy and democratic socialism, and we talk about this a little bit, this relationship between death and social movements. The other thing I want to, or a way I want to address this is, I mean, I do think ideally you try to create space in which these successful experimental successful attempts at experimentation for democratic life can sort of coalesce together in a sort of larger holding environment. And so this is why I'm always interested in experiments like, the Zapatistas or what's happening in Rojava and Syria right now. Can you create these relatively free zones where more than one or two of these things can go on? And then can they link together in solidaristic action or what, Cooperation Jackson, what's going down in Jackson, Mississippi. And again, in response to incredible headwinds, right, in the politics of Jackson, Mississippi, right, and politics in Mississippi in the South. So can you look for ways in which these can build up into larger, more stable entities? And this is sort of the lesson that my co-authors and I are taking from Graeber and Wengrow, which is actually cutting against some of Wolin's idea of fugitive democracy and this idea that it's just this eruptive moment, because I think we have emerging evidence, not just in our contemporary world, but in the long span of the human species, that non-hierarchical settled forms of life are possible and have succeeded and thrived for centuries in some places. And, so you have to take the long vision, right? I mean, I'm going to draw the blank on the name of this book, but The Supposed Sanity of Normal Men or something like this, Milner, a great psychoanalyst, as that continues to sort of run up against the shores, then there will be sort of spaces, sort of disaster zones to be sure, but disaster zone spaces left relatively open for experimentation to take place. And this is like the Camille stories in Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble. And so looking for ways in which to sort of provide a structure of encouragement for these little moments of experimentation in the nation state system, but then also thinking about how they could constellate into broader forms of life. I think those are the two trajectories that I'd be interested in thinking about there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David, one of the things that you said that struck me, when we do work in Appalachia, we're always, I think we like you, we do begin with the proposition that a gential possibility is innate, inherent, and to be celebrated, and remains the possibility that we are all really working to assist and help folks catalyze for themselves. All good. The problem in Appalachia is twofold. One is the almost absolute lack of neoliberal interest in economic terms in those communities going forward. And the second is still more tortured, which is the kind of masking of the emasculation of those communities by providing a kind of cultural claim that takes the place of people's self-understanding. Both of those we've seen working, and they're both, to be blunt, very, very sad. I wonder how you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. You're absolutely right. I mean, I would say on the former, on this question of sort of economic opportunity and the sort of absence of investment in these spaces and the way in which that sort of holds down a sense of possibility and well-being and all these things. I mean, I suppose you have to rely upon the sort of turning wheel of these things, right? Where like the development of new technologies, the development of new sort of, new resources to exploit, but those can be, or new resources to sort of develop, right? all the problems that come along with historical ways of doing that. But so again, this is where I think the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, reimagining capitalism, post-capitalist future, take back the economy. I think there's a lot of resources in that sort of literature for thinking about economic development in a sort of non-neoliberal sense. And I don't have it myself in my own work, don't have anything novel to add to that, but I will say that I think there's a lot of possibilities that just happen as the sort of wheel turns in this respect. And hopefully this doesn't keep grinding people down. I think on the sort of cultural script or the sort of, compensatory, I mean, that's, it's what's the matter with Kansas argument kind of, right? Or strangers in their own land sort of argument, that there's these sort of compensatory discourses and rhetorics of, Trumpist sort of populism of, nostalgia for this great time of greatness, which can come back through the sort of lionization of this particular leader and the demonization of outsiders and all these sorts of things. I mean, as that gets in and gets its grip and gets its hold, it's really hard to uproot, right? But I interpret that or read that as human beings' ineradicable need for meaning, right? And for stories and even mythologies that speak to that need for meaning and organize that need for meaning in a way that allows people to sort of move through their lives, right? And for me, there's always an opening there. It may not be with folks in their 50s and 60s who have been building up this narrative for 10 or 20 years or so, but it might be more so with their children, if the children are even staying around, right? Where that story, first of all, there's a generational friction advantage where you can take advantage of the rebellious nature of the generation not to believe the stories their parents believe, to create an opening for a new story, but also just the openness of the youth to new narratives. And I mean, I think of all the great narratives of, call it small d democratic community that came out of Appalachia in this country in the last 300 years. I mean, the Highlander Folk School is in Appalachia, right? I mean, a lot of these sort of campaigns for unionization, all the resistance to them, what we understand, were Appalachia. A lot of great music, which is such a cultural sort of lubricant, comes out of Appalachia, right? Like, so the resources that are there, that can be shifted or turned by the sort of encompassing narrative or myth that constellates those resources in a different way. I mean, I think as powerful as that grip of, say, Trumpist populism is right now, it's got a timestamp on it. It's not eternal, right? And so I think that work of in this book that Joel and Ali and I are writing, we're calling it Earthborn Democracy, and we're really focusing on this question of myth and what's the relationship between myth and democracy, and how can you create stories that tell stories which put people towards what you were saying earlier about this imminent inherent capacity to have agency in their lives and in their world. And we live in a world that is suffused with myths of popular powerlessness, right? Mm-hmm. And can you can storytelling, can myth building, can storytellers and musicians can shift that, alter that. Like it is plastic, just as the gut microbe is, just as the brain is. So that's where the hope lies for me.
I guess, just to follow up quickly, but this is all really helpful. Thanks. One of the curious contradictions as you work in Appalachia is to see it going both directions at once. That is, the kind of myth building, narrative building, new story, this is who we might become, constantly confronted with neoliberal efforts really to take over the story once more. So to redefine it as the commodification of the arts, for example, or to redefine it as the commodification of the ideal of imagination itself. We've seen that happen as well. And so we're always working on a kind of knife's edge in those terms. I don't disagree with you. I just think that, and you're right, I think, in terms of where you go about it. I'm just really curious about, or we are, about that ongoing dynamic, because we see it so often in communities in which we're working.
Yeah, well, you know, you're where the action is. If you're on the knife's edge, you're where the action is, right?
We like to think so.
Yeah.
Marcel, you're muted. Still muted, Marcel.
Can we unmute directly? No.
I don't know what the problem is.
Thank you, Brad. I'm connected from my phone and it's just misbehaving. Thank you so much for all this valuable contribution. I have a question. Actually, I was really interested into this concept of building a democratic community. And then I was just curious as to how can we build a democratic community when a large percentage of the population is made of citizens who are more and more giving away these attributes of citizen to behave more like mere consumer, empowering the market. How can we, in this position, think of building a democratic community?
Yeah, that's. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
No.
Okay. No, this is a profound question, and all these questions have been great. I mean, I used to think, that had to sort of be replaced. That you had to sort of uproot this consumer mindset and plant completely new seeds, right? And I think that is unrealistic. What I think you do is you cross-pollinate, because I think there is something small d democratic within the idea of choice in the marketplace. I think the delivery of that is in a situation of radical asymmetry, right? Radical hierarchy. And I think it tends to sort of feed that. But I think there is a democratic idea within that, the possibility of choice within the marketplace. And so I don't think you can eliminate that. I think it is a real threat to the sort of more public political thinking that is out there. But I think it's too deep to fully uproot. What I think you need to do is to crowd it and cross-pollinate it with other ways of making choice, with other forms of choice making, as opposed to trying to say that your orientation as a consumer is anti-democratic or is anti-political. I mean, I tend to think that it's more about the balance between these things, right, than it is about one or the other. Because every radical Democrat that I know still purchases things on the marketplace, right? And there are ways in which the ease with which money can move around now is radically democratic in some respects, because you can go give to Cooperation Jackson's Venmo right now, and you can open up a GoFundMe page and get other forms of funding or sourcing resources that just were not available 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now that's the entrails of a global capitalist system, which is choking out a lot of solidaristic forms of life, but not completely, right? Not completely. And so can you find those sort of interstitial zones to push back and taking advantage of that which has been dropped off by sort of global capitalism. So I think it's a losing strategy to say, you know, if you are oriented as a consumer, then you are not being political. I think it's a better strategy to add in more political, deliberative, participatory, democratic forms of choice making onto that kind of consumer mindset or mentality, and seeing these things as part of an ecology of choice making, which I think we would want to stand behind as small d Democrats. So does that make sense at all?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. Well,
I think it's.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh,
Shane.
go ahead. Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's Przeworski who says something along the lines like, yeah, you know, when you go to work, you're expected to just do what you're told. And you know, when you go to the store, you have to buy what's available and so on and so forth. And then there's this magical, you know, once every 4 years where you go exercise your democracy or something. I did have a follow up, maybe if possible, about, I was thinking about conflicts. And I found it really interesting in your piece on fugitive democracy, how the sort of the two binaries that I see set up, you know, and obviously not binaries, but in the sort of you know, Cartesian sense or whatever, but you know, this ambivalence between like renewal and flight, but also the sort of tension between, you know, the depleted sample, you know, what democracy as it is versus the kind of normative, aspirational, like democracy as it could be. And I like that that portrayal generally, but it also leaves me curious about that other, you know, binary, which is like us versus them, you know, left versus right. And especially if a portion of that, and so I mean, like the Greensboro, you know, thing is, you know, how do you get more conflictually separated than, like, you know, PKK and Nazis versus, like, you know, communists, right? And so it's like but in the contemporary moment, I think we've seen, you know, at least a subset of the population who's captured or swayed by a particular kind of anti-democratic politic, which is, you know, it could be called neo-fascist or something. And so it's like, if there are folks in the polity who don't share the aspirational vision, or who maybe don't want a democracy at all, like, you know, I think there's people who would want somebody like Trump to be like king or something. Like, I'm not really sure. I'm just curious what you think about the fruitful possibilities there.
Yeah. Well, this is where I tend to be hyper local in how I conceptualize democracy, you know, like, because I think Aristotle may be onto something, that once you get past like 10,000 people, it's hard to have a polis where people can sort of feel connected and solidaristic with one another. And as you get to scale, I think there is this temptation towards hierarchy and centralization. Again, I think that there's ample emerging evidence in our deep history of the species to sort of push against that, but that's kind of my initial tendency. And I think, yeah, there's a way in which so much of our politics is kind of captured by this really sort of quasi-sophisticated, symbolic, you know, discourse-driven, online, you know, driven cancer, you know, which can't cash out an actual sort of deliberation or conversation or collaboration. And so there, in that context, there's all these incentives to hypostasize and to exaggerate difference. And And so the person who's just a little bit to the right of you becomes the fascist, and the person who's just a little left of you becomes the communist. Like, so it's almost like you recreate the polarized situation that you're describing in Greensboro in 1979 between, the Communist Workers' Party and the KKK. It's hard to imagine a more polarized situation, but like, there's a way in which a lot of our mechanisms of engaging in politics kind of create that polarization where it doesn't even really exist, this whole idea of false polarization. And in a local context, it's a little bit easier to identify when false polarization is going on and to depolarize and to create better context for collaboration and engagement. Not to say it's easy, not to say that won't leave conflict left over, right? But there just seems to me to be greater possibility there. And so that I don't feel that there's a top-down fix for Trumpism, right? Like I do think this is kind of a bubbling up of these experiments in democracy, and then the collective unconscious that is representing. That's sort of where I put my wager. But yeah, I mean, again, you can go the road of describing all the obstacles to this, and you will not run out of ideas before you run out of oxygen, right? But the more generative place to sit, to stand, to operate, to move is the knife edge, to Max's point, where there is this possibility, as slim as it may, and dangerous as it may seem.
I'm conscious, David, we've kept you past your hard stop, and I apologize for that. But thanks so much, and in any case, for staying with us.
No, I noticed that, but I'm so happy to talk with you all, and I really appreciate these great questions. So,
Shane, are you wrapping?
Sorry, that was definitely 100% my fault, but yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you. Peace.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye now.
Be well.